Listen closely, my friends. There is a moment right before you die when everything you postponed will collapse into a single breath. Every apology you never gave. Every hour you burned on people who never deserved your fire. Every fear you obeyed instead of question. That moment is coming for you, and it is coming for me, and nothing either of us does will stop it. But here is the strange gift hidden inside that terror. The people who have looked at death the closest, who have stared directly into it instead of flinching away, are the same people who learned, finally, how to live. 2,000 years ago, a small group of thinkers in Greece and Rome built a way of seeing the world so sharp, so unsentimental, that emperors, slaves, generals, and prisoners all reached for it in their darkest hour. They called it Stoicism. It was not a philosophy for comfortable afternoons or quiet libraries. It was built in plagues, in exile, in chains, in war, on battlefields and in prison cells, by people who had every reason to give up and refused. And it survives today because it was never about ideas for their own sake. It was a weapon for living, forged by people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Think about that for a moment. The men who built this way of thinking were not comfortable academics, theorizing from a distance about suffering they had never touched. One had been a slave whose leg was broken by his own master. One buried nearly every child he ever had. One was exiled from everything he loved, twice, and rebuilt his life from nothing both times. They did not write about resilience because it sounded impressive. They wrote about it because it was the only thing standing between them and total collapse, and it worked. If you are watching this because something in your life feels unbearable right now, a loss, a failure, a fear you cannot name, a version of yourself you no longer recognize in the mirror, you are exactly who this was written for. What follows are 10 lessons drawn from that ancient weapon, tested by people who had far less room for error than you do right now. They are not comfortable. Some of them will feel like a hand closing around your throat before it lets you breathe again. But if you let them in, if you actually let them change how you see your one and only life, you will walk away from this video a different person than the one who pressed play. Lesson 1. The rope that isn't yours to pull. Picture a lighthouse keeper standing on a cliff during the worst storm of the year. Ships are being thrown around like driftwood. Somewhere out there, sailors are screaming into wind that swallows every sound before it can travel more than a few feet. The keeper cannot calm the sea. He cannot reverse the wind. He cannot reach into the black water and pull a single one of those drowning men out with his bare hands. All he can do, the only thing he has ever been able to do, is keep his light burning steady, so that whoever survives the night has something fixed and reliable to steer toward. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control the storm instead of tending their own light. They rage at traffic that does not know or care that they exist. They replay arguments with people who have already forgotten the conversation entirely. They lie awake at 3 a.m, rewriting a past that will not be rewritten no matter how many times they run the tape. Epictetus, a man who spent years in chains before he ever spent a single day free, built his entire teaching on one brutal, clarifying distinction. Some things are within your power, and everything else is not. And confusing the two is the root of nearly every unnecessary suffering you have ever felt in your life. Your reputation is not yours. Other people's opinions of you are not yours. The outcome of your effort, the result at the end of the road, is not yours either. What is yours is smaller than you think and infinitely more powerful than you realize. Your judgments, your choices, your effort in this exact moment right now as you listen to this sentence. That is the whole territory you actually govern, and it is enough. because it was always the only thing that was ever going to determine whether you suffered or whether you rose above it. Think about how much of your day gets swallowed by things you cannot touch. The comments section under a post you should have never read. The promotion someone else got for reasons that had nothing to do with your worth. The weather on the one day you needed sun. None of it moves an inch, no matter how hard you grip it, and every second spent gripping it is a second stolen from the light you were actually put here to keep burning for someone who needs to see it. This is not resignation, and it is not giving up, no matter how much it might sound that way at first. It is the opposite. It is realizing that your energy is finite and precious, that you will never get today back once it has passed, and every ounce you spend on the uncontrollable is an ounce you cannot spend building the one thing that was always within your reach, yourself, your character, your response to whatever the world decides to throw next. There is an old exercise worth trying the very next time you feel your grip tightening around something outside your control. Ask yourself a single question, out loud if you have to. Is this thing in front of me something I can act on directly, right now, with my own two hands, or is it something I can only watch and hope about? If it is the second kind, the grip you are holding is not protecting you from anything. It is only exhausting you for no return at all, hour after hour, day after day, while the actual work of your life sits untouched, waiting for the attention you keep spending elsewhere. There is a second, quieter part of this lesson that most people miss entirely. Once you stop fighting the sea, you are left with an uncomfortable amount of silence, because you no longer have the storm to blame for your unhappiness. That silence is not empty. It is the space where responsibility finally lives, uncontested, waiting for you to pick it up. Most people avoid that silence for years because blaming the storm is easier than tending the light. But the keeper who finally stops blaming the wind is the only keeper whose light ever actually saves anyone. Lesson 2. The verdict you signed without a trial. Imagine a woodcutter walking past the same bent, twisted tree every single day for years on his way into the forest. Everyone in the village calls it the ugly tree, the failed tree, the tree that grew wrong from the very beginning. Then one winter, a storm flattens every straight, proud tree in the forest, snapping them clean at the trunk in a single violent night. The bent tree is the only one still standing in the morning because its very deformity had quietly taught it, year after year, how to bend without ever breaking. Nothing about the tree itself changed that winter. Only the judgment placed on it changed, and with it, everything about how the tree was finally seen. This is the second brutal insight the Stoics handed down to us across 2,000 years. It is never the event itself that wounds you. It is the verdict you pass on the event, usually within a fraction of a second, usually without a trial, without evidence, without any real chance of appeal. Someone cancels plans, and you rule, silently and instantly, that you are unwanted. You lose a job and you rule just as fast that you are worthless. The event happened out there, in the world. The wound happened in here, in your own private courtroom, and you were the one holding the gavel the entire time. This single realization, that our reactions are opinions and not facts, would later become the seed of an entire branch of modern psychology built on retraining exactly this kind of automatic, punishing self-verdict. But long before any modern science proved it in a laboratory, Stoic teachers were telling their students the same thing in the middle of a plague-ridden, war-torn world with none of our modern comforts. Strip away your opinion about what happened to you, they said, and examine what is actually left underneath it. Usually, what is left is far smaller and far more survivable than the story you built around it in the space of a single panicked heartbeat. You are not required to believe every verdict your mind hands down the instant something goes wrong. You are allowed to appeal. You are allowed to ask, is this actually true, or is this just the fastest, most familiar way? My mind knows how to suffer because it has practiced suffering this exact way 1,000 times before. The people who master this question stop being victims of their own thoughts and start becoming judges of them instead, which is a fundamentally different way to move through a single day on this earth, and it changes everything downstream of it. Consider how differently the woodcutter would have felt walking past that tree for years if he had judged it correctly from the very first day, instead of only after the storm proved him wrong. The tree was never actually ugly. It was resilient the entire time, and the label the village gave it said far more about the village's narrow definition of beauty than it ever said about the tree. The same is almost certainly true of some verdict you passed on yourself years ago, a verdict you have never once thought to appeal. Try this the next time something wounds you. Today, this week, the next time life catches you off guard. Separate the raw event from the story you immediately wrapped around it in the first few seconds. The event is neutral. It happened. It is finished. It cannot be changed, no matter how much energy you spend wishing it otherwise. The story is yours, freshly written in real time, and stories, unlike events, can always be rewritten with a steadier hand. Consider how much of your own personal history has been shaped not by what actually happened to you, but by the earliest verdict you happened to pass on it, sometimes as a child too young to appeal any ruling at all. A single offhand comment from a parent, repeated once, absorbed as permanent fact. A single failure in front of classmates, filed away as a life sentence about your own ability. The event lasted seconds. The verdict has been serving its sentence for years, sometimes decades, entirely unexamined, entirely unappealed, simply because no one ever taught you that the courtroom was still open for a retrial. Lesson 3. Turning the blade against the wound. There is an old image, older than most of the philosophies built around it, of a blacksmith holding raw iron over open flame in the dark of a forge. The iron does not choose the fire. It cannot escape the heat, cannot negotiate with the hammer that will soon fall on it again and again, cannot decide it would rather stay soft and shapeless forever in a corner somewhere, safe and untouched. And yet it is precisely that unwanted violence, that unchosen suffering, that turns shapeless ore into something strong enough to hold an edge, strong enough to be trusted with real weight in the real world. Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled an empire through plague, war, and betrayal from people he trusted, wrote to himself in the dead of night, in a journal he never intended for anyone else to read, that the obstacle in the path becomes the path itself, that what blocks the action can be turned into the action. This was not a slogan he repeated for comfort on his worst nights. It was a working method he used to survive years that would have broken almost anyone else who ever wore a crown as heavy as his. Every difficulty placed in front of him was reframed, deliberately, forcibly, as material to be worked with. Not as punishment sent to destroy him, as material sent to shape him. Most people treat hardship as proof that life has turned against them personally, as though the universe has singled them out for cruelty. A relationship ends, and they read it as evidence they are unlovable at some fundamental level. A business fails, and they read it as evidence they were never capable in the first place. But the iron does not read the fire as evidence it was never meant to become a blade. The fire is simply the mechanism by which shapeless material becomes something with an edge, something with a purpose, something worth carrying into battle. Your setbacks are not verdicts on your worth, no matter how convincingly they disguise themselves as one in the moment. They are, more often than not, the exact temperature required to forge whatever you are actually trying to become, whether you asked for that temperature or not. This does not mean you pretend the pain does not exist, because that would be its own kind of lie. The iron genuinely burns in the flame. The blacksmith is not lying about the heat when he warns his apprentice to be careful near the forge. But there is a difference between denying the fire and deciding what the fire is for. One path leaves you shapeless forever, terrified of ever being placed near flame again, flinching at the memory of every burn. The other path leaves you sharp, tempered, and finally useful for something that matters, something heavier than you could have carried before the fire ever touched you. The next time life throws you into the fire without asking your permission first, ask yourself the blacksmith's question instead of the victim's question. Not why is this happening to me, as though the universe owes you an explanation it will never provide. Ask instead, what shape is this heat trying to force out of me, because something is always being shaped in that moment, whether you cooperate with it or fight it every step of the way. There is a version of you on the other side of every fire you have ever walked through, and that version did not exist before the heat. You cannot meet them by avoiding the forge. You can only meet them by staying in the flame long enough to be reshaped by it, which is a harder thing to accept than almost any other lesson on this list. Notice, too, that the blacksmith never asks the fire to be gentler, because a gentler fire produces a weaker blade, and a weaker blade fails at the exact moment it is needed most. There is a temptation, when life turns up the heat, to pray only for relief, for the temperature to drop back down to something comfortable. But comfort was never what built the edge you are going to need later, in the moment that actually matters, and the fire that feels unbearable today is very often the reason you will still be standing when something far heavier finally arrives. Lesson 4. The company that writes your character. There is a story told about two apprentices who start their training on the same day, in the same city, with the same raw talent. One placed among master craftsmen who demand precision, patience, and honesty in every single joint of wood they cut, and the other placed among men who cut corners, lie to their customers, and mock anyone foolish enough to try doing the work properly. 10 years pass. Neither apprentice ever consciously chose to become who they became. They simply absorbed, invisibly, day after day, the standards of the room they happened to spend their working hours in. Seneca warned his students about exactly this invisible contagion nearly 2,000 years before modern research confirmed it. He said that we never return home from certain company with the same character we brought into it, that something rubs off on us whether we notice it happening or not, the way a sick man's illness can pass to someone who never touched him, only stood near him, and breathed the same air for too long. Character, in this sense, is not built in isolation, alone in a room with your own good intentions. It is built in rooms, among people, and most of us never once audit the rooms we spend our entire lives standing in. There is a reason certain rooms feel exhausting to leave, and other rooms feel energizing to leave, even when nothing dramatic happened in either one. The exhausting room was quietly asking you to shrink to fit it. The energizing room was quietly asking you to grow to meet it. Most people never name this difference out loud, and so they keep choosing the exhausting room simply because it is familiar, mistaking familiarity for belonging. Ask yourself honestly what standard the 5 rooms you spend the most time in are quietly training you to accept as normal. If the people around you treat mediocrity as an acceptable outcome, some part of you is being trained to accept mediocrity as acceptable too, no matter how loudly you insist otherwise inside your own head when no one else is listening. If the people around you gossip, cut corners, or shrink from difficulty at the first sign of resistance, you are absorbing a blueprint for gossip, corner-cutting, and shrinking, even if you never once agreed to any of it out loud or on purpose. This is not permission for cruelty toward the people currently in your life, and it is not a call to abandon everyone who has ever disappointed you. It is a call to honesty about what proximity is doing to you, silently, every single day, whether you are paying attention to it or not. You do not have to burn every bridge tonight in some dramatic act of self-improvement, but you can start choosing, deliberately and with real intention, to spend more of your limited hours near people whose standards are higher than the ones you currently hold for yourself, and fewer hours near people who have quietly been giving you permission to stay exactly where you are. There is also a mirror side to this lesson that most people conveniently forget. You are not only a passenger absorbing the standards of the rooms you enter, you are also, whether you like it or not, contributing your own standard to every room you walk into. Someone else's character is being written, in some small part, by the version of you they spend time around. That is not a burden meant to paralyze you with guilt. It is simply the other half of the same truth, and it means the choice to raise your own standard is never a purely selfish one. The rooms you stand in are writing your character, whether you are paying attention or not. And you are writing a line or two into every character standing near you as well. The only real choice available to any of us is whether we choose the rooms and the lines we contribute to them on purpose instead of by accident. Lesson 5. Rising before your excuses do. There is a particular kind of farmer, the kind whose crops never fail even in a hard year of drought or flood, who wakes before the sun does, not because someone stands over him forcing it, but because he understands something most people never learn in their entire lives. The field does not care how tired he feels this morning. The weeds grow whether he slept well or not. The only variable he actually controls, the only lever available to him at all, is whether he shows up to meet the day before the day has already decided everything without him. Marcus Aurelius argued with himself about this exact struggle in the pages of his own private journal, the same journal he never intended anyone else to ever read. He wrote about the pull of the warm blanket, the temptation to stay curled beneath the covers instead of rising to do the work he was, in his own words, born to do as a human being with a finite number of mornings left. If the most powerful man in the known world had to argue himself out of bed on some mornings, you are not weak for feeling that same pull every single day. You are simply human, exactly the same as he was underneath the title and the crown. But notice carefully what he actually did with that pull, instead of simply losing to it. He did not indulge it, and he did not shame himself for feeling it either, because shame rarely gets anyone out of bed faster. He simply asked himself a sharper question than the blanket was asking him. The blanket asks, wouldn't it feel better to stay warm just a few more minutes? The sharper question asks, what was I actually made for, and is staying warm really the answer I want to give myself on this particular morning? Most mornings, staying under the blanket wins by default, simply because nobody ever bothered to ask the sharper question out loud before reaching for the snooze button. Winning the first hour of your day is rarely about discipline in the way most people imagine it, all gritted teeth and white-knuckled willpower dragged out of thin air. It is about deciding, the night before, which question you are going to let win in the morning before you are even tired enough to negotiate with yourself. The people who rise early and build extraordinary lives out of ordinary days are not immune to the pull of comfort. They have simply trained themselves to notice the pull, name it honestly the moment it arrives, and choose the sharper question anyway, morning after morning after morning, until it stops requiring a fight at all and starts feeling like who they simply are. There is a deeper reason this particular lesson matters more than it first appears to. The way you meet the very first hour of your day sets the tone your mind will use to interpret every hour that follows it. Lose the first hour to the blanket and the excuse, and you spend the rest of the day in a slightly apologetic catch-up posture, chasing a version of the day that already got away from you before it began. Win the first hour, even by a small margin, and every hour afterward inherits a small advantage it did not have to earn on its own. Tomorrow morning, before you reach for the excuse that is already waiting for you, ask yourself the sharper question: what were you actually born to do today, with the limited number of mornings you have left on this earth, and is 5 more minutes of warmth really worth trading it for? There is nothing glamorous about this particular lesson, and that is exactly why so few people actually apply it. It does not promise a single dramatic transformation. It only promises that tomorrow, and the morning after that, and the one after that, you will meet the day slightly earlier than your excuses expected you to, and that small margin, repeated for months, becomes the largest and least visible advantage a person can build. Pause here for a moment before we continue, because if you have made it this far, something in what you just heard is already working on you, whether you have noticed it yet or not. Most people watching something like this will let it wash over them for an hour, and then return, by tomorrow, to exactly the life they were living before they pressed play. That is not a judgment against you. It is simply the ordinary gravity every human being has to fight against, the pull back toward the familiar, even when the familiar has stopped serving them. Here is the honest question worth sitting with right now, before the next lesson begins. Of the 5 lessons you have just heard, which one landed the hardest, and why do you suspect that particular one was the one that landed? Usually the lesson that stings the most is not a coincidence. It is the one pointing directly at the exact place in your life where you have been quietly avoiding the truth for longer than you would like to admit, even to yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts. Lesson 6. Rehearsing the loss before it arrives. There was once a merchant who, before every voyage, forced himself to sit quietly in his own home and imagine the worst possible outcome of the journey ahead of him. The storm that sinks the ship without warning. The cargo lost forever to the ocean floor. The years of accumulated work erased in a single night of bad weather that no one could have predicted. His rivals thought him morbid, even cursed, for dwelling on disaster before it had any chance to happen. But when disaster eventually did strike, as it strikes everyone eventually no matter how carefully they plan, he was the only one among them who did not fall apart completely, because some part of him had already survived this exact loss 100 times over in the privacy of his own mind before it ever touched his real life. The Stoics practiced a version of this deliberately, sitting with the possibility of losing what they loved most, not to invite misfortune closer, but to strip fear of its single greatest weapon, the element of surprise. Seneca wrote that nothing should ever come as a surprise to a person who has properly prepared themselves, that we should send our minds ahead into every possible difficulty on the road, so that when difficulty actually arrives, we greet it as something rehearsed, rather than something that ambushes us from behind while our guard is down. Most people do the exact opposite of this. They avoid even the thought of loss, as though thinking about it might somehow summon it into being, and so when loss inevitably comes anyway, it arrives as a total stranger they have never once prepared themselves to meet. This is not pessimism, no matter how similar it might sound on the surface. A pessimist expects disaster and does nothing at all to prepare for it emotionally, simply waits helplessly to be crushed by whatever comes. This is closer to a soldier checking every single buckle on his armor before a battle. He sincerely hopes he will never actually have to fight. You do not check the buckles because you want the battle to come. You check them because if the battle comes anyway, despite every hope otherwise, you would rather meet it standing on solid ground than meet it caught completely off guard with your armor half fastened. There is a particular kind of freedom hidden inside this practice that is easy to overlook at first glance. Once you have honestly sat with the worst outcome and found that you are still standing inside that thought, something in you quietly relaxes for the first time in years. You stop spending your daily energy defending against a catastrophe you are secretly terrified even to name out loud. The catastrophe has already been named, examined, and survived in your imagination, and what remains is simply the ordinary work of living, unburdened by the weight of an unspoken fear. Try sitting just once this week with the honest thought of losing something you currently take completely for granted, whether it is your health, a relationship, or the life you have built. Not to torture yourself with worst-case scenarios on a loop. Simply to notice, with some genuine relief, that you are still standing even inside the thought of it, and that the version of you who survives that imagined loss is sturdier and steadier than the version of you who refuses to ever look at it directly. The people who fear loss the least are rarely the people who have lost the least in their lives. They are, almost without exception, the people who stopped pretending loss was avoidable and started preparing for it like the merchant, quietly, honestly, long before the storm ever actually reaches the harbor and takes anything from them at all. There is a strange side effect that shows up once you practice this regularly, one the merchant himself likely noticed but rarely spoke about. The things you have honestly rehearsed losing become, paradoxically, things you appreciate far more while you still have them. The sailor who has imagined the ship going down watches the sunrise from its deck differently than the sailor who has never once let himself consider it. Gratitude, real gratitude, does not usually arrive on its own. It arrives on the back of a clear-eyed look at how easily everything you currently hold could be taken from you tomorrow. Lesson 7. The applause you were never owed. There is an old street performer who for years built his entire sense of worth around the size of the crowd gathered to watch him each afternoon. On days the crowd was large and generous, he felt invincible, certain of his own talent and his place in the world. On days the street was empty and quiet, he felt like a fraud who had wasted his entire life on a talent nobody actually wanted to see. It took him until his final years to notice something devastating about the whole arrangement. His skill had never once changed based on the size of the crowd watching him. Only his sense of himself had, and he had spent decades handing complete strangers the power to decide whether he was allowed to feel proud of his own two hands. Epictetus taught his students to draw a hard, unforgiving line between what belongs to us and what belongs entirely to other people's opinions of us, and applause belongs entirely to the second category, no matter how good it feels in the moment it arrives. It is not yours. It was never yours to begin with. It arrives and departs based on moods, trends, and circumstances that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual worth of the work you did that day. The moment you build your identity on top of applause, you have quietly handed over the deed to your own self-worth to a crowd that will change its mind about you before the week is even over. This does not mean you should stop caring whether your work is genuinely good, because indifference to quality is not what any of this is about. It means the measure of whether your work is good should live inside your own honest, demanding standards, not inside the fluctuating size of the crowd happening to watch you perform it on any given afternoon. The performer whose skill stayed exactly the same on both the crowded days and the empty days had already done the actual work required, long before either crowd showed up or failed to. What changed was never the work itself. What changed was only how loudly the world happened to be clapping for it that particular afternoon, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Ask yourself, honestly and without flattering your own answer, how much of what you do each day is aimed at genuine excellence, and how much of it is secretly aimed at being seen doing something that merely looks like excellence to whoever happens to be watching. The two are not the same thing, even though they can look identical from the outside for a very long time. Only one of them will still feel worth doing on the day the crowd finally stops watching entirely, and eventually, for every single one of us without exception, it does stop. There is a quiet test worth running on yourself here. Imagine the exact same piece of work you are proudest of, but imagine that no one, not a single person, will ever know you were the one who made it. Does it still feel worth having made? If the answer is yes, you have found something real, something that belongs to you in the way the Stoics meant it. If the answer is no, you have found, gently and without judgment, a place where the applause had quietly become the whole point. Build the version of your work and the version of your character that would still feel worth having, even if no one ever clapped for it again as long as you lived. That version, and only that version, was ever really yours to keep. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person once they finally stop performing for the crowd, and it is worth naming honestly because it can feel at first almost like loss. The applause was loud, and its absence can feel like silence pressing in from every direction. But underneath that silence, if you stay in it long enough without running back toward the noise, is something sturdier than applause ever was, your own opinion of your own work, arrived at honestly, answerable to no one but you. Lesson 8. The hourglass you refuse to look at. There was once an old clockmaker who spent his entire working life building precise instruments to measure time for other people, intricate mechanisms that ticked away the hours of strangers he would never personally meet, while somehow never once turning that same relentless precision toward his own remaining days on this earth. On the morning he finally understood, with total clarity, that his own hourglass had nearly run empty, he did not feel despair the way he expected to. He felt something closer to relief, because for the first time in decades, every remaining grain of sand suddenly mattered enormously, and he stopped wasting the ones he had left on things that had never deserved them. Seneca made a claim that still unsettles people today, nearly 2,000 years after he first wrote it down. Most life is not lost through some single dramatic tragedy, he argued. It is lost quietly, a day at a time, handed away to distraction, delay, and the comfortable, unexamined assumption that there will always be more of it later. He said we do not actually have a short life. We simply waste a great deal of the one we were given, and the waste is so gradual, so invisible day to day, that most people never even notice the hourglass emptying until there is almost nothing left inside it to notice. Looking honestly at your own mortality is not the morbid exercise most people assume it must be from the outside. It is closer to what the clockmaker finally did in his final years, turning his precision instrument toward his own remaining time, instead of only ever measuring everyone else's. When you actually let yourself feel, for even a single honest minute, that your days are numbered, and that number is entirely unknown to you, something remarkable happens almost immediately. The petty argument stops feeling worth having at all. The apology you have been withholding out of pride suddenly feels urgent. The work you have been postponing for some day suddenly demands, quietly but insistently, to be started today instead. This is not about becoming afraid of death, or letting that fear paralyze the very life you are trying to protect. It is about using the plain fact of death as a filter for everything you do while you are still fortunate enough to be alive to do it. Would this argument matter to me on the final day of my life? Would this grudge I have been carrying for years? Would this fear that has quietly shaped so many of my decisions without my even noticing? Most of what currently feels enormous in your life shrinks almost instantly once it is placed next to the true, undeniable size of the hourglass. There is a particular kind of courage that only becomes available to you once you have looked honestly at your own mortality. A courage that has nothing to do with recklessness and everything to do with clarity. The clockmaker who finally looked at his own remaining time did not become reckless with the days he had left. He became precise with them in exactly the same way he had always been precise with the instruments he built for other people, finally applying his own craft to his own life. Look at your own remaining time honestly, just once this week, the way the clockmaker finally looked at his. Then spend what is left of it like someone who actually understood, at long last, that it was never unlimited to begin with, no matter how it felt on all those ordinary mornings when you assumed there would always be another one waiting for you. Lesson 9. The fortress that cannot be stormed. Picture an ancient walled city under siege, arrows raining down on the outer walls night after night for weeks, the enemy trying every possible method to break through before winter arrives. But somewhere deep inside that city, protected by wall after wall after wall, sits an inner chamber that no siege has ever managed to reach, a place the attackers cannot touch, no matter how long they camp outside the gates, because it was never built anywhere their weapons could actually reach in the first place, no matter how far they advance. The Stoics described something remarkably similar living inside every human being who has ever walked the earth, an inner citadel that external circumstances cannot actually storm unless we ourselves open the gate and let them in willingly. Insults, setbacks, cruelty, betrayal by people you trusted, all of it can hammer against the outer walls of your life relentlessly, day after day, and none of it can actually touch the innermost chamber. Your judgment, your character, your capacity to choose how you respond, unless you personally hand over the key to whoever happens to be attacking you that day. Most people live as though every insult, every setback, every unkind word from a stranger has already breached the inner chamber, has already reached the part of them that decides who they fundamentally are. But notice, if you look closely enough, how often the actual damage was self-inflicted, not by the enemy outside the walls at all, but by the gatekeeper inside, who panicked in the noise and confusion and threw the gates open without ever actually being forced to. The siege outside your walls is often loud, frightening, and completely unable to reach the room that actually matters, unless you happen to be the one who lets it in out of fear or exhaustion. Building this inner fortress does not happen by accident, and it does not happen overnight, no matter how badly you want it to. It is built the same way any real fortress is built, one deliberate stone at a time, through the small, unglamorous daily practice of noticing when you are about to hand over the key and choosing instead, in that exact moment, to hold on to it a little longer. Every time you feel provoked and pause before reacting, you are laying another stone in that wall. Every time an insult lands, and you notice it landing on the outer wall rather than sinking into the inner chamber, you are laying another stone whether you realize it or not. There is also a strange comfort in remembering that the siege itself was never personal in the way it feels in the heat of the moment. The wind does not hate the lighthouse. The arrows do not hate the wall they strike against. Most of what attacks your peace each day is simply the ordinary chaos of a world that was never built around your comfort in the first place. And once you stop taking the siege personally, it becomes far easier to hold the gate closed against it. The next time life lays siege to you, and it absolutely will, sooner than you think, remember that the walls were built to hold against exactly this. The only real danger was ever the gatekeeper opening them from the inside, and you, more than anyone else alive, are the only one who has ever held that particular key. It is worth remembering that no city stayed standing forever simply because its walls were strong on the first day. Walls crack, gates rust, watchmen grow careless after too many quiet years without incident. The inner fortress works the same way. It requires maintenance, not because the design was flawed, but because anything built to withstand pressure eventually needs the pressure checked and the stone repaired. The people whose composure seems unshakable are rarely people who built their fortress once and forgot about it. They are people who walk the walls daily, out of habit, long after the last siege ended. Lesson 10. The debt you were never asked to owe. There is an image worth holding in your mind for a long moment. A bird raised its entire life in a gilded cage, fed, sheltered, admired by everyone who walks past its cage and pauses to comment on how beautiful it is. And a second bird, wild, unowned, flying somewhere over open country with no guarantee of food and no cage protecting it from the coming weather. The caged bird has comfort, real and undeniable comfort, but has traded its entire existence for the approval and convenience of whoever happens to hold the key to its door. The wild bird has nothing guaranteed except the freedom to be exactly what it actually is, storm or no storm. So much of human suffering comes from living like the caged bird, quietly performing a version of yourself designed to please whoever happens to be watching in that particular moment, convinced somewhere deep down that your safety depends entirely on their approval. The Stoics insisted over and over again, in different words across different centuries and different empires, that you do not actually owe anyone that performance. You do not owe the world your compliance with expectations you never agreed to and never consciously chose for yourself. Freedom, real freedom, is not the absence of hardship, no matter how comfortable that definition might sound. It is the absence of needing anyone else's permission to be exactly who you actually are underneath it all. This is a genuinely terrifying kind of freedom to accept, because the cage really was comfortable in its own limited way, and the open sky really does come without a single guarantee attached to it. But the caged bird never gets to know what it was actually capable of, because it traded that knowledge away the moment it accepted the cage as an acceptable price for comfort. The wild bird risks everything it has every single day, and in exchange it actually gets to find out what its own wings were built for in the first place, a discovery the caged bird will never once make, no matter how long it lives. You do not owe anyone an explanation for the life you choose to build for yourself, as long as it is built with honesty, discipline, and the four old virtues the Stoics kept returning to again and again across everything they ever wrote: courage, moderation, justice, and wisdom. Everything else, every expectation, every comfortable cage ever offered to you in exchange for your own freedom, is a debt you were never actually required to pay in the first place, no matter how convincingly it was presented to you as one. There is one final piece of this lesson worth sitting with before we close. The wild bird does not resent the caged bird, and the caged bird, in its better moments, does not need to resent itself either for choices already made. It is never too late to open the door you built for yourself, one small decision at a time, the same patient way the fortress was built stone by stone, and the same patient way the blacksmith's iron was shaped blow by blow. Freedom is rarely a single dramatic leap. It is usually a door left open a little wider each day until eventually you simply walk through it without needing to decide to. Decide today which bird you would rather have been on the day your own hourglass finally runs empty, the day nothing about your life can be edited or reconsidered anymore. The one who stayed safe inside the cage everyone else admired from a comfortable distance, or the one who found out at whatever cost it demanded what it actually meant to fly on its own terms. Notice that no one ever builds a cage for you all at once. It is built slowly, one small accommodation at a time, one swallowed opinion, one abandoned interest, one quiet surrender to what was expected instead of what was true, which means the door out is built the same patient way, one small refusal at a time, one honest opinion spoken instead of swallowed, one interest picked back up after years of neglect. The cage was never a single decision. Neither is the freedom waiting on the other side of it. 10 lessons, one single thread running quietly through every single one of them. You do not control the storm, the crowd, the siege, or the hourglass, and you never actually did, no matter how hard you gripped at any of them. You control the light you keep burning on the worst nights, the verdict you refuse to sign without a trial, the shape the fire forces out of you when you least expect it, the rooms you choose to stand in day after day, the question you let win each and every morning, the losses you rehearse honestly before they ever arrive uninvited, the work you would still do without a single person clapping for it, the honesty you finally bring to your own mortality, the gate you refuse to open from the inside, no matter how loud the siege becomes, and the cage you finally decide one day to leave behind for good. None of this is comfortable, and it was never supposed to be comfortable in the first place. Comfort was never what kept Marcus Aurelius ruling through plague and betrayal, or kept Seneca writing through repeated exile, or kept Epictetus teaching for decades after years spent in actual chains. What kept them going was the brutal, clarifying knowledge that their remaining days were limited and unowed to them by anyone, and that the only real failure available to any of us, in the end, is spending those limited days asleep inside a life we never actually chose for ourselves in the first place. You are going to die. So am I. Neither of us knows exactly when or how, or whether there will be any warning at all before it happens. But for however many mornings you actually have left on this earth, you now carry something most people spend their entire lives quietly avoiding: the plain knowledge that the storm was never yours to control, that the light was always yours to keep burning no matter how hard the wind blew against it, and that today, this exact ordinary day, is the only day you have ever actually been given to finally start doing it. If any part of this reached you, do not let it end the moment this video does and fade by tomorrow morning the way most things do. Subscribe, and let the next lesson find you before life eventually forces you to learn it the hard way instead, in circumstances you would never have chosen for yourself.